Hey guys, so I am back to do another book review. This one is slightly different and it's for Giva and Tom Fletcher's Eve of Man, book one in their newish trilogy. Now, to be honest, I really wanted to like this book, or at least enjoy it, because the premise of it had quite an interesting hook. So, Eve of Man is basically about the human race is on the brink of extinction because only men have been born for 50 years. And then Eve is born, so then to kind of keep her safe, she is raised in a dome over what remains of London, and she is basically being trained up to reboot the population of the human race and hopefully produce more girls. And a love story develops between her and one of the high in command's sons, and that in itself was a bit, but the whole thing is this new society and what is real and what is being fabricated and what are lies and what are the truth. Now, the premise of this was very dystopian and it was high fantasy, but the problem was that the writing in itself did become very juvenile. Now, from what I gather, both of these authors wrote different chapters from different perspectives. So, one person wrote Eve, one person wrote Bram. I felt that the writing for both was very, very similar. In that, when I read it, I genuinely couldn't pick up on who was talking unless, the cues at the start of each chapter to say whose chapter it was. But when you read it, their styles somehow felt quite similar. All of the sentences were quite short and abrupt and quite. Yeah, there wasn't much difference between the way the characters spoke and the way they fought, even though they were two different people of two different genders. That in itself was a bit off-putting after a while. The only reason I kind of enjoyed this book, I'll admit, was Charlotte Ritchie and Josh Dillon, who were the narrators for this book as I listened to it on Audible. Charlotte Ritchie, as particular for Eve, was brilliant in her narration, and I would most definitely listen to more books that she narrates as long as the book is good. This was very mediocre, and like I said before, it was very juvenile in the way it executed quite a lot of its themes. There was also quite a bit of a stereotypical view on men and women. So women were basically extinct at this point. Anyone who's under the age of 65 is pretty much Eve. Eve is the only woman under the age of 65. So medically, she is kind of an age to start reproducing. But it was like they were trying to go into these high staked, dark, mature themes, and then there was no paying it off. Because Eve was essentially taught from a young age that men were prone to give into their animalistic urges of lust, which is a negative view. So basically saying any man who would be left in a room alone with Eve would most likely assault her because they can't control their urges. That in itself was a very negative stereotype that was heard a lot throughout this book. And the problem was that then Eve was put into situations where this was almost the case. She even fought it at one point when she was alone with a man in a lift because, and the way it was written, it did come across as quite dark and what might go on, and then it just suddenly wasn't. And that in itself was it threw the reader off, and not in a, oh thank God, but it's like you've built it up to be one way, and it felt very uncomfortable, and now we're supposed to be okay with this character after that borderline assault pre-assault moment where you think he's going to do something and then he doesn't, and then we're supposed to be okay with him. I feel like he would be a third love triangle. I'm going to say this. I'm going to call this right now that Michael will probably be the third love triangle between Bram, Eve, and himself. I'm just going to say that. But yeah, let me go further into it. So the world building, you've got EPO who are basically in charge of Eve, and they are kind of giving a propaganda message to the whole of the world, saying that Eve will save humanity, yada yada yada. But Eve has only got 3 selections of people that they say they've vetted, and really that wasn't the case. These people weren't appropriate, and Bram, who is basically Eve's childhood friend and playmate, presented as a woman, that in itself, he was a hologram for all of their life because they weren't allowed in the same room. There was a lot of this stuff that it could have been interesting but wasn't. So you've got EPO on one side and you've got the Freevers on one side who are like a rebel, free Eve group, but a lot of them are men and very few are elderly women. There was a clear gender divide between men and women, but it was this could have been a really interesting book where it played with gender roles and gender fluidity and especially within this day and age. But men and women were, of a sense, very kept within their boxes of this is what a man is, this is what a woman is. And those characteristics were very apparent aside from a couple characters. I honestly thought Bram was going to be a gender fluid character because he was a character who at the start of the book almost identified with his Eve, with his Holly projection, because he spent half of his life being Holly, half of his life being Bram, and most of the romantic scenes were technically between Holly and Eve. So it was almost like queer baiting the readers to say, look, these characters are, both are being presented as women, but there's really a man behind one of these. And it's like Eve kind of admits to herself that, she's kind of seeing the person rather than the gender. Whereas Bram is kind of constantly all about Eve. So this could have been really interesting to play with gender stereotypes, but they didn't. And also there was this very kind of... I enjoyed Eve's chapters more than Bram's. Mostly due to Charlotte Ritchie's performance, I will say. But also the fact that Eve's character made more sense given her environment. And I will say that the author who wrote Eve, that person, I'm not going to say whether it's Genova or Tom, because I don't want to gender stereotype, although I will probably assume that Giovanna wrote Eve and Tom wrote Bram. That's most likely the case. I feel like this book would have been good with just Eve, and I would have given that author just free rein to write Eve's story, because that in itself was more interesting. It felt more believable, whereas Bram, I felt like, was being forced into a role he wasn't prepared for, he had no experience in, and he was suddenly this heroic rebel leader, and yet he wasn't even trained as a soldier. I had moments where I thought, why is Bram the secondary protagonist in this story? He literally serves no purpose aside from, kind of reacting to roles he is put into by people who are older and wiser, and it makes no sense why they've given this 18-year-old free rein to lead a rebel group. So I'm going to go into a little bit of spoilers here. There is a moment where Bram escapes EPO and he joins the rebel group Freevers, who their whole main game is to free Eva from the corrupt society who is molding her into being this figurehead, and they want to free Eve. But I'm just honestly thinking, what would the Freevers do with Eve if they got her out? I honestly don't think neither of these societies were to be trusted, but that would be another case if, this was executed better. So, Bram joins the Freevers, and I kid you not, 2 days pass, and he is made leader of a rescue mission for someone in Eve's family, only because he knows where a tree is. That is the only reason he has been given this power up until this point. And I'm sitting there thinking, why is Bram suddenly the leader? Why couldn't he say, look, this is where the tree is, I'd recommend we do this. And Frost is still in command. Bram is given way too much power, way too much credit than his character actually deserves. And I'm just thinking, why are we giving Bram this control when he hasn't earned it, he doesn't deserve it, he doesn't know how to use it, but he has written it in a way that it's like, oh, I know, he's given these big epic speeches, and I'm thinking, he has been trained his whole life to be a projection, he is physically fit, not so much mentally able to kind of have common sense. Because I, even as a writer, I was kind of thinking there were moments where Bram put himself in ridiculously dangerous situations with people of power, and he kept talking. And it's like, I felt like it was a very weak narration, it was a very weak execution, and I felt like Bram was mainly used as, just to kind of show another side of the society, whereas in terms of story, this kind of made no sense how they got away with half of the stuff that, they managed to achieve when anyone would have killed them by the end of it. The end is this big rescue mission, and they are being chased by multiple armed professional guards. There's only 2 of them by this point, running to the exit. Multiple guards with guns, and I know this sounds morbid, but I would have fired. Eve is the only one realistically you need to keep alive. Bram could have been shot at any point to kind of say, no, we mean business. Eve is the only one realistically you need to kind of keep alive. So I kind of found it unrealistic that they were able to run from Eve's, dome area to an exit, being followed by armed guards, and nothing happens, and they watch them escape, and they think they can talk them down with words. It's like, no, open fire, wound one of them. You only need to keep evil. I know I shouldn't be rooting for the corrupt government, but it was like, I'm not even going to go on a YA trip and kind of say, oh yeah, for a young adult audience. No, good writing is good writing. It doesn't matter whether you're writing a children's book, adult's book, young adult's book. If you can write good, anyone of any age within reason can pick up that book and read it and enjoy it. I read this book and I was thinking, this is so juvenile, and it's unrealistically juvenile as well. So for that reason, I didn't enjoy this book for a multitude of reasons, but mainly its immaturity and lack of common sense. They kind of set up this very vast, interesting world, and there was literally, the characters were literally dumbed down to make the 2 protagonists look better and more smarter and more able than what they were, given the vastness of this world. They were able to break into a high security dome that no one has been able to get in or leave in the last 16 years, so to speak. Eve was able to leave with Bram on an escape route that no one has really been trained for. They tried to cover this up with a practice run, but no one's had to use it. So I kind of felt like, are these two going to die? Like, are we going to end this here? But I feel like they're going to survive. But they've got power over Eve. Sorry, pardon me. Yeah, they've got power over Eve now with, what they have of hers. And it's just like, it's almost like they were writing this to be a film. But it's not a film, it's a book series. And just the world building, it's not like Hunger Games or Noughts and Crosses where the world and the character, or, I could just think of a few authors right now. If you look at Mallory Blackman, Philip Pullman, or Suzanne Collins, those books are very dystopian, but they also take into account that they've got quite young characters, most of them, teenagers at most. And they are in a high politically charged, corrupt government, and they are at such a disadvantage. It is not made like, oh yes, they can win over this corrupt government. No, they kind of have moments where they are weak, they are vulnerable, they know that it is, the odds are more than stacked against them, and there is a vulnerability to them. Whereas with this, it's like wish fulfillment. And I kind of felt like Tom Fletcher has mainly written for children. His wife, Giovanna, has mainly written chick lit. So there was a bit of maturity with Giovanna's writing, if I am right to assume she was the writer for Eve. I honestly would have read this if it was just Eve as the protagonist, and probably would have given it a higher rating because Bram was so ridiculous, and a lot of exposition was explained through dialogue. And there were many times where I thought Bram could possibly be killed off, and no one would know or care at this point. But he wasn't. Instead, he was suddenly the rebel leader of a group who, when their leader dies, why isn't there a second in command or someone to challenge Bram? Why is Bram given all this control over people he's known for 2 days? That in itself was so... it made no sense. And it also just... the world building was very juvenile and quite ridiculous in itself. Right, so I've kind of gone on a bit of a negative, ranty review today. So I kind of want to try and give a few positives, but I honestly feel like the world building was, they set up this vast politically charged world and nothing was paid off. The characters were cliche. There were even cliche lines of dialogue and thought processes that I found myself inwardly cringing at because of its juvenile cliche writing. And the execution of how the story played out, a lot of dark themes were set up and nothing was paid off. Eve was in a very vulnerable, situation, and it was felt. Characters died in Eve's story and it was felt. Bram's story I felt like was a lot weaker, and when you put both of these together, it didn't flow. It really, really didn't kind of have the same impact. It didn't feel like two writers coming together, and it felt the same. When you look at both of the writing, they both wrote very similar. The only difference is one author seemed to go into quite more darker themes without being melodramatic, and the other, you had deaths, you had like explosions. It was very visual, but I didn't care that characters died because we'd only seen them for 3 scenes to be blunt. There was no impact on when these characters were killed off. Whereas another, it didn't have the same impact. So that in itself, I felt like was very weak, and the ending, I felt like was wish fulfillment. I would have gone down a darker route. I would have ended it with a much darker ending, but that's just me. I probably would have gone down a complicated route to build up to the second book. This was such a ridiculous ending that they both escaped when they're being charged, when they're being, surrounded by armed guards who could very easily wound the pair of them. Eve just needs to be kept alive. She just needs to be the reproductive organ, which is horrible to say. But it could have gone down a much darker route, and instead it didn't have its payoff.